People can join while I'm introducing it, perhaps. Okay. So, hello everyone. I want to welcome you all to our event. We should have people possibly from the Grassworks Network, the Make Votes Matter campaign, our own Pro-Europa members, and of course a special kia ora to our friends from Down Under and our speaker, Andrew Geddis. My name is Hector McGillivray. I'm part of the Pro-Europa Brussels team. So I want to say something about us quickly. We're an association of British and other Europeans, mainly based in Brussels. We campaigned for a main and for a second referendum. And now we're supporting closer and hopefully warmer relations between the UK and the EU. Today is not likely to show much of that. We're also deeply concerned at the trend towards disinformation that is undermining democracy. Taking back control, as the UK government sought to do, seems to mean it's a government elected by a minority of the voters that is asserting more control, not Parliament or the people. That's why we favour moving to proportional representation for a fairer and more consensual style of politics. Which brings me to our speaker. Professor Andrew Geddis of Otago University in New Zealand's Greenstone Island is a well-known academic and researcher in the field of public law and democratic theory, and in particular, electoral law. He's also a media commentator on issues of general concern. He's therefore eminently placed to speak about New Zealand's path to electoral reform, and in particular, the move from first past the post, and also how this has affected politics in the country. There'll be a question and answer session following Andrew's talk. Before I pass the floor to our speaker, a few housekeeping points. Please ensure you're muted unless given the floor. Please put forward your questions in the chat, but preface them with the word question in capitals to ensure they don't get lost. We're recording this event and we'll put the recording on our YouTube channel. Now, it gives me great pleasure to pass the floor to Professor Geddis.
Well, no mai haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa. I am Professor Andrew Geddis, as Hector so kindly introduced me. Thank you for the invitation to speak. It's a pleasure to be able to talk halfway around the world via the magic of the interwebs without having to burn up the carbon miles flying over there directly. So, you know, this is one thing that we've learned to do that COVID has taught us. It's a particularly auspicious occasion to be talking about MMP today, because yesterday was actually the 25th anniversary of our first MMP election. When we were scheduling this talk, I have to admit I didn't make that connection, but it turns out to be, you know, have a nice synchronicity to be discussing this issue 25 years after we first used MMP. And I'll have to say something about how those 25 years have gone. What I plan to talk for about 30 minutes, about half of it on how Aotearoa New Zealand came to get MMP, the origin story, if you like, and then about half on how it's gone since, the practice of MMP and some of the changes it's made to our politics. But I'll commence by speaking on the road to MMP. Every story has a kind of arbitrary beginning. I mean, we tell stories that start long, long ago rather than long ago or long, long, long ago. So with that in mind, you know, the necessary arbitrariness of starting at any one point, here's MMP's origin story. So long, long ago, New Zealand inherited the first past the post voting system from the United Kingdom. Essentially, you know, Britain colonized New Zealand, Britain brought its electoral system with it. So we got first past the post because, you know, Britain created us as a modern state. The winner takes all nature of first past the post then meant that New Zealand developed two main political parties. We have our National Party, which is equivalent to your Tories, and we have the Labour Party, which not surprisingly is equivalent to your Labour Party. First past the post then applied in New Zealand in a particularly disproportionate way. So Even though it was the same voting system as was used in the United Kingdom, its effects in New Zealand were much, much more disproportionate than they were back in its homeland, if you like. So post-World War II, and all the elections post-World War II, the National and Labour parties won over 97% of all the seats, even as its overall share of the vote dropped to about 70%. So you had these two parties, National and Labour, capturing virtually every seat at every election, even as about 30% of the voters started to turn their votes towards other parties. Those other parties just got no look in under the way Firstpastthepost operated in New Zealand. So we had a duopoly system. We basically had National and Labour, and no other party was able to break through. Furthermore, the way Firstpastthepost worked in New Zealand created some outcomes that just looked unfair beyond that basic disproportionality. So in 1978 and 1981, two elections in a row, the National Party won more seats in Parliament and therefore the right to govern, even though the Labour Party won more of the popular vote. So Labour got more votes, but National got more seats and therefore governed. In 1984, Labour was then able to actually win government. This is the so-called fourth Labour government. Not surprisingly, it was the fourth one elected. And again, not surprisingly, that fourth Labour government was somewhat motivated to pursue electoral reform, having just suffered this outcome in the last two elections. And so the fourth Labour government appointed a royal commission to study all aspects of the voting system, all aspects of our electoral processes. That royal commission then took a couple of years to do what royal commissions do: gather evidence, get advice, go out and talk to people, and so on and so on, and then reported back in 1986. And that Royal Commission report in 1986 recommended that New Zealand should leave the Firstpastthepost voting system we'd used since our first elections in 1853, and instead adopt this new MMP, mixed member proportional voting system. And the Royal Commission's reasons for doing so were numerous, but basically they broke down to three. First of all, they said MMP will create better representation. It will increase the spread of views that are represented in Parliament, and it will also increase the types of people who get elected. We'll just get better representation as a result. Secondly, the Royal Commission said MMP will be fairer to parties other than National and Labour because of its more proportional outcome. You'll actually be able to have other parties have a look in and an ability to get into Parliament. And then the third reason why the Royal Commission said MMP was a good bet was they actually went to West Germany, where mixed member proportional was being used, and they said it's working really well. Look how well West Germany is doing, look how well its society operates, look how good its economy is going. This just looks like a really good voting system. So the Royal Commission produces this report, it gives it to the government, and the government is horrified because the government did not expect anything of this magnitude. And so the government at the time, 1986, sought to bury the report, said, thank you very much, moving on. However, this report would then become crucial to MMP's adoption in New Zealand because it gave a comprehensive defence of an alternative to Firstpastthepost for proponents of change to rally around. Right? It gave an alternative system that could be put up and said, look, we could do this instead. And proponents for change then uniformly said, we will go along with what the Royal Commission recommended, and rather than fight over whether STV or alternative vote or MMP are better, we will rally behind this one alternative. And that becomes important later in the story. The fourth Labour government was not only interested in electoral reform. It was also at this time engaged in a wholesale reordering of large sections of New Zealand society and economy. Basically, the 1980s in New Zealand was Thatcherism on steroids. It's really hard to emphasise just how radically the fourth Labour government sought to change the basic practices and nature of New Zealand at that time. After 6 years of the fourth Labour government, we had an election in 1990, and the National Party was elected on an explicit promise to halt that reform process. The National Party said, we've done enough, it's been too destructive of society, it's just been a bit too much, we'll stop it. But then upon gaining office in 1990, that National Party intensified and extended those reforms. They actually carried them through in a greater degree. And once again, it's hard to overemphasize the public disenchantment that this created with politicians at this point. There was a feeling that no matter how you voted, you got the same thing, and that thing was something you didn't like. And because of the duopolistic system that we had, there was no alternative as to how you voted. I mean, you could try to vote for a third party, and people did. 30% of the population turned to third parties, but they did not win seats in Parliament, and so you ended up with either National Labour, who were doing the same thing. And this then led to a systems crisis. I mean, the legitimacy of the whole system of government in New Zealand was really coming under strain. People were stopping believing in the legitimacy of the governmental system. And the pivot point of elections was identified as being the problem. People started to realize, look, the way we are electing people is causing these substantive outcomes that we don't like. One promise that the national government didn't break, one thing they said they'd do, which they then carried through with, was a promise to hold a referendum on electoral change. This was a promise that the National Party had made in 1990 because they were desperate to win office. And so they sought to capitalise on disenchantment with Labour having buried the Royal Commission's report and not doing anything about it. So they said, we'll give you a vote. We'll let you guys choose whether you want to change the electoral system. And they kept that promise. So in the early 1990s, they set up a referendum process to decide whether to change the electoral system. And that referendum process was held in 2 stages. First of all, in 1992, people were asked whether they wanted to change the voting system, just a simple do you want to change or not question, and also what alternative would you like to see if there was change. Over 80% of the people who voted at that first referendum said they wanted change, with over 70% saying they wanted MMP instead. So there was an overwhelming vote in favour of change and an overwhelming vote for MMP as the alternative. However, turnout at that first referendum was only 55%. It was a mid-term referendum, right? You actually had to go and vote just on this one particular issue. And obviously only those people who were really motivated for change participated. Nevertheless, it was such a significant outcome that the government was basically bound to then carry through with the reform process. As was said at the time by one of our leading politicians, the people didn't just speak at this election, they screamed. So after this first referendum, Parliament then went away and considered and enacted a bill that set out MMP voting system in full. So there was actually legislation drafted, debated and voted on that was then sitting there that set out in full detail, this is what MMP will look like. And that was all done before the second referendum in 1993, so that when people voted in the second referendum, they knew what it was they were voting on, which seems like a very sensible way to run a referendum. So that second vote in 1993, people were asked simply, do you want to retain first past the post, or do you want to change to this new MMP system? The system that's already been enacted, that's already sitting there waiting to go. And by a 54 to 46% majority, slim but still significant majority, people voted for MMP. The turnout at that was 87% because it was held alongside a general election. And as a result of that majority vote, the legislation to create MMP was automatically brought into place. So the referendum vote automatically meant MMP was adopted. The government didn't have to do anything thereafter. So, to summarise, what factors were critical to MMP being introduced? I mean, what could we say really caused MMP to get put into place? Well, first of all, there was widespread disillusion with politics as usual and the system that chooses elected representatives. It really needed this crisis in the substance of politics to make people concerned about the process issues. Right before then, in the late 1980s, in the late 1980s, this discussion of, electoral reform was all quite abstract. It was all dealing with, voting systems and so on. People weren't that focused. But once this crisis in the substance of politics came about and people started to realize, look, how you elect people actually matters for the kind of outcomes you get, then people did focus on the electoral system and began to take an interest in it. The second factor I think that was critical was that there was a well-organized campaign for electoral reform that was unified behind a replacement system. So all of the people who were campaigning for electoral reform were agreed, we will campaign for MMP based on the recommendations of the Royal Commission. And the Royal Commission's recommendations then legitimated MMP as a system, so that the campaigners could go out and say to the general public, look, there's this other system that might look a bit odd, but look, these very sensible, clever people in the Royal Commission have looked at it and they say it's much better. Wouldn't it be good to give it a chance, given that the existing system is producing these outcomes you don't like? And then the third sui generis thing that perhaps can't be replicated is the actions of some individuals. In particular, Geoffrey Palmer, who was the Labour Minister of Justice, who appointed the Royal Commission in the first place and had a great interest and concern about constitutional issues generally. And then Jim Bolger, who was the National Prime Minister who went through with the referendum, even though he was personally opposed to the change. And to his credit, he said, look, we promised it, we have to let the people have the say. I can't back down on this because, frankly, it would delegitimize government generally. So we got MMP. It was put in place. The first election held under it was held in 1996, 3 years after the referendum, and we've been using it for 25 years subsequent. We've had 9 elections under MMP because New Zealand has a 3-yearly electoral cycle. All but one government has gone full term. So all of the governments elected using MMP have run for their 3 years, bar one. The exception was in 2004 when the Labour government called an early election because it was in the high 40s in the opinion polls and thought that this was a chance for it to get a single party majority under this proportional representation system. So the only time that we've had an early election was where the governing party saw a chance to actually get a majority. All the other governments have managed to run full term, despite, as we'll see in a second, being an amalgam of different parties having to work together. New Zealanders are broadly happy with how MMP operates. And I can say this because in 2011, voters were actually given the chance to say at another referendum whether they wanted to keep or change MMP. We had another referendum, 2011, a chance, as the Prime Minister said at the time, to, quote, kick the tires of the electoral system. And at that referendum, 58% of the voters voted to keep MMP, 42% wanted to change. So 54% wanted to adopt it back in 1993, 2011, 58% said they wanted to keep it. What has MMP then actually done? What effects has it had? Well, I've pulled out 4 effects that I think are worth discussing. The first effect, and the most obvious one, is that under MMP, multi-party governments are now the norm. We're in a weird situation at the moment because of COVID, where the Labour Party actually is a single party majority government because it did so well combating COVID in 2020. A majority of voters, a literal majority, 50%, gave their vote to the Labour Party, so they are a single party majority. They are the exception to the rule. All other governments under MMP have been multi-party arrangements. Those multi-party arrangements, however, have developed so they are not formal coalitions. Rather, we've set up in New Zealand a quite novel governmental arrangement that we've developed after a period of trial and error. We've never designed it this way. It just is the way things have turned out because it works best. So what happens is after an election, one of the major parties, Labour or National, negotiates to gain the parliamentary majority needed to enter into government. So they go off to other parties, they get those other parties' support. With the other parties' support, they have a majority, and so they form government. The smaller party or parties then agree to support Labour or National in government. And by support, what they mean is that they will vote confidence and supply. They will agree, yes, you, Labour, or you, National, may govern. They then agree to advance certain common policy issues. So they have literally an agreement where they say, on these issues, we will do these things. They then agree to work, quote, in good faith to address other issues as they arise. So if something novel comes up, we will, in good faith, discuss what we will do about it together. Some members of that smaller party then gain ministerial portfolios and are bound by collective responsibility in relation to those portfolios. So the leader of the smaller party may become the Minister of Taxation or may become the Minister of the Environment and is bound in that role to be collectively bound to the government. But otherwise, beyond this, the party or parties that are supporting each other are free to pursue their own policies and speak on or vote in Parliament on issues as they see fit. There's no assumption that the parties that are cooperating in government will agree and work together and support each other on everything. They will only do so on those matters they've agreed to do. And this is developed in order to create a balance between allowing smaller parties access to governing power. They can have some of their policies advanced, they can have some of their members having ministerial roles, without those smaller parties becoming submerged in the larger governing party's shadow. Because the general public usually thinks of the government as either being the Labour Party or the National Party. And these smaller parties have to have the freedom and the ability to say, hey, remember us, we have our own distinct existence, we have our own distinct policies, we think this is what ought to happen, even if our partners in government disagree and will do something else. Stability in this arrangement is then ensured by very harsh lessons learned early in MMP's history that voters will punish smaller parties that are seen to interfere with or hamper government's operations. In the early governments under MMP, smaller parties did try to overplay their hand, and the public turned on them and decimated them at the next election. So the smaller parties have learned that if they push too hard and try too much to get their way, the public will blame them for any resulting instability, any resulting problems. This governing model, I'd note, has been adopted after the most recent Scottish election. Scotland, with its voting system that's very similar to New Zealand's MMP system, now appears to be adopting this approach to overall governance as well, because of the benefits it provides, particularly for the smaller parties in the arrangement, having the ability to retain some independent character, which they need to take to the voters at the next election. Second point that's come out of MMP is that politics has become a somewhat messier competition between multiple players. Under Firstpastthepost, it was easy. There was National fighting against Labour, duopoly, Coke or Pepsi. Under MMP, things have become much more complicated. Now we have a general right bloc and a general left bloc with parties on each side that will never support the other across that divide. And each bloc wants to grow at the expense of the other. So we have the right bloc, which is basically the National Party and another party called the ACT Party. We have the left bloc, which is Labour and the Green Party. And National and ACT want to increase their share of the vote. Labour and the Greens want to increase their share of the vote. Whichever bloc gets bigger will form the next government. Within each of those sides, however, within each of those blocs, there's competition to grow support for each party at the expense of the others. So the ACT Party and the National Party are in a competition to increase their vote. The Labour Party and the Green Party are in a competition to increase their vote at the other's expense, because the most likely voters for each will come from each. And floating free are then centrist parties that make a positive claim to be able to work with either side. Vote for us, and we can work with either side of the blocks in order to advance the policies that we have. And most important in these centrist parties has been the New Zealand First Party. The New Zealand First Party is a populist party that campaigns on a general keep the bastards honest platform. That's their main claim. Put us in there and we will make sure whichever party wants to govern has to behave itself because we will keep them honest. The New Zealand First Party has governed with both National and Labour. They will work with either side. Whoever is bigger, whoever needs them, they'll work with. New Zealand First Party campaigns in poetry. Now, when I say poetry, I mean angry man on the street shouting poetry, where they run on populist themes, good bluff common sense. We have too many immigrants. I'm sure you're familiar with the sorts of claims. But it then goes on to govern in prose, because its leader is a consummate political insider who wants to be in government for government's sake. And so once he's ensconced himself in government, all the radical claims made on the campaign trail disappear, and he sits very nicely within the government system. New Zealand, I think, has been very fortunate in that our vehicle for populist outrage, right, the New Zealand First Party sops up the angry, disenchanted vote. It's actually a deeply cynical outfit that has no actual intention of carrying out what it tells its supporters. It will campaign radically, but to do so merely to get power, which it will then use in a quite traditional, slightly conservative bent. The third thing that MMP has achieved is far greater diversity of representation. Most obviously, the number and range of parties in Parliament has markedly increased. We've gone from the duopoly to having, at the most, we had 7 parties. At the moment, we've got 5 parties in Parliament. However, National and Labour remain the main representation vehicles, even with proportional representation. At the last 3 elections, the National and Labour Party together took 75 to 80% of the total vote between them. So voters, the majority of voters, still look to National and Labour as the main vehicles for representation. Smaller parties have entered Parliament, but only with very small shares of the vote. Beyond that, what Parliament looks like under MMP has markedly changed. New Zealand's Parliament at the moment is almost 50% female. It's 11% LGBTQ. It has over 20% Māori members of Parliament, where Māori are about 16% of the general population. So our Indigenous population is actually overrepresented in New Zealand's Parliament on straight numerical terms. 7% of our MPs are Pacifica, from Pacific Islands background, as opposed to 5% of the population. And key to that increased diversity of representation has been the role that the party list seats play under MMP. The ability of political parties to place a diversity of people on their party lists in order to increase their attractiveness across all voter blocks in a way that's just not possible where you've got a pure constituency-based electoral system where you're trying to appeal to the median voter in each constituency. And fourthly, the final thing to talk about what MMP's done, the policy enacted by Parliament under MMP has hewn closer to the view of median voters. There's been work done on this to study how MMP has affected the kind of outputs that Parliament produces and the way in which those outputs actually reflect what median voters think. And that is a result of the fact that everything that goes through Parliament requires consultation and cross-party negotiation now. Outside of this weird position we're in at the moment because of COVID, where we have a majority government, governments require multi-party discussion in order to get the numbers they need to advance any policy proposal. Now, obviously, that slows down the process of policy development and implementation, right? But it does so in a context where New Zealand was known as the fastest lawmaker in the West. We used to make law in a ridiculously quick fashion. So in the New Zealand context, slowing things down and making it a bit more difficult to get things through Parliament is actually a good thing. And Parliament can still move very quickly if there's a genuine reason for needing to do so. As we've seen in relation to COVID, our Parliament has been able to pass legislation to deal with COVID in a week. Literally a week, the bill is introduced, by the end of the week it's law. So I'll conclude by asking, is everything in the garden lovely? Because I've made, quite a glowing kind of account of what MMP's done. Pretty much yes, but there's still a few issues with MMP as it operates that need a bit of a look at. Most importantly, the thresholds through which representation can be gained in our Parliament perhaps requires a rethink. So under MMP, in order to actually elect an MP, either their political party must get 5% of the party vote, so 5% of the entire population has to support the party, or that party has to win one of the electorate seats. They have to get an individual MP elected in an electorate. Now, those thresholds each have a problem. The first is that the 5% threshold is a very high hurdle for new party entrants. And in fact, since the first election in 1996, we have had no new parties emerge under MMP that have been successful in getting elected, because 5% is such a high and difficult threshold that no one has been able to surmount it since the first days of MMP. And the electorate option, the ability to get MPs in if you win an electorate, gives an unfair advantage to voters in certain contested seats. Those seats can literally determine the makeup of Parliament and the future makeup of the government, which is an unfair balance in the vote. These matters are going to be considered by a review of the MMP that has just been announced by our government, not a review on whether MMP should be retained or replaced. New Zealand is committed to MMP. It's not going to go anywhere for at least a generation. Rather, the mechanics of it and whether those are operating as well as they could are currently up for review, and we will see where that takes us. So anyway, I've talked for slightly over 30 minutes. I will now finish, and I welcome any questions. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm quite heartened by what you've said, which is basically a message of hope, as I see it. Something that could, in the UK, which is our particular focus, give us a hope of less cultural war and a fairer system generally. I'd like to call on Joe Pye to ask a couple of questions about the role of the press in the campaign for PR, and I think another one. Joe?
Right, yes. Good evening. This is absolutely fabulous. So good. And although there are a few participants on here, a lot of us have got quite a big reach. And it would be lovely to be able to put a lot of this out. Can I ask, what part did the New Zealand press play in getting the public behind the change to PR? Did you have a hostile press that similar to the one we have in the UK? That was the first question.
Mm-hmm. So we don't have Murdoch, which helps. The newspapers were largely against this sort of strange innovation, changey type thing. The only major newspaper that was supportive was the New Zealand Herald, which is the main newspaper in Auckland, which is the largest city. The other newspapers campaigned against it, including in my hometown, Dunedin, where they actually put an editorial on their front page on election day saying, "Don't vote MMP." So the press, I think, can't be blamed or praised for the introduction of MMP. Really what drove it was grassroots campaigning. The fact that the Electoral Reform Coalition, the people who were pushing for change, had over a number of years been creating strong grassroots organizations that were able to turn out a large number of volunteers to actually go around door knocking and delivering leaflets. And it was that old school, retail campaign politicking that won the argument in the day. Against a background, again, it must be emphasized, where people were really receptive to why such change was needed, not just in a abstract fairness, or wouldn't it be nice to have a different process, but look, the system of electing people has meant you have had these policies that you can't do anything about. Unless you change that system, it's going to keep going.
Thank you. And shall I put the second one? Do you have, can I ask, do you have contacts at the moment with the pro-PR movements that we've got growing in the UK at the moment? Because what you say is absolutely germane to a lot of the questions that we throw around to each other and sort of wander around in a bit of darkness. You've got living proof of how a system got put together and got and the practicalities of working it. So do you work with do you have links? Would you like links if you don't have them?
I don't, but I'm more than happy to chat about the stuff. So I talk about it a lot, so I can talk about it with other people too.
So you'll talk about this afterwards, possibly with Sharon and involved?
Sure.
Would that be okay? Thank you.
Just bearing in mind that it's getting on for close to 10 o'clock in the evening here.
Oh yes,
we can talk. Maybe not tonight,
no,
but it's something
offline. Another day.
Yeah, sure. Yes, quite.
Yes, could I ask, William Tobin has a question, a more technical question about STV.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Hello.
Hello. Yes, I was in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the 1990s, and I seem to remember that there was at some point, perhaps it was the 1992 referendum, serious consideration of other systems such as STV and multi-member constituencies, and that STV lost public support when the Bosses organisation backed it. Can you remind me, since it is 30 years ago?
Sure. So what happened at that first referendum was people were asked the general, do you want to change, yes, no question. And then they were also given the opportunity to say, here are 4 alternatives. Which of these would you prefer? And STV was certainly one of those alternatives that was put up. It was MMP, STV, alternative member, and a 4th one that has now slipped my mind. Point being, there were these 4 options. And the Electoral Reform Coalition was very strongly MMP is what we want. That should be the alternative preferred. But there were others who said, well, no, maybe we could change from first past the post to something that's not fully proportional like MMP is, but sort of a halfway house. And STV was certainly liked by some people, including, from memory, I think, as you say, there was a push from the business community to say, well, maybe it would be a preferable alternative. But the vote at that first referendum was 70% of people saying we want MMP instead. And at that point, debate over the alternatives died. Right? It was so clear it was going to be, that MMP was the only option on the table, that everyone then turned to, okay, how should it work?
Okay, thank you. I have to say that, having lived in New Zealand to 2006, it was a wonderful reform. All my friends in New Zealand equally think it's it's been the biggest political change of the last 30 years and a very welcome one. I have a second question with not my Kiwi hat on, but my British hat on. I stood in the Prime Minister's constituency in the 2019 UK general election to highlight unfairness in the UK franchise. But amongst the 11 other candidates who were standing, there were 4 who claimed to be intergalactic time travelers. And there was one hilarious woman who claimed to be Bojo's public relations representative, vote for me and get 2 blondes at the same time. Now, my impression, again, following the adoption of MMP, is that the McGillicuddy Serious Party and its ilk, which used to be relatively strong as a protest vote, completely disappeared once everybody's vote counted, as is the case with MMP. Do you have any comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, we still do have both micro parties that are, whether by design or accident, slightly comedic, and do sop up, sort of 0.01 or 0.02% of the vote. But and also in each electorate, anyone's free to stand if they want to, pay the $300 deposit and lose it at the end. So I wouldn't say the fun has completely gone out of politics in New Zealand. It's not like, everyone is now turned into serious policy wonks who just focus on it. But it's true that with a far greater range of alternatives for your vote that are then actually going to be meaningful and so on, there are those options to go, to put yourself into.
Yes, well, I have to say, in the past, I have voted for the McGillicuddy Serious Party, being in a constituency, Ilam constituency,
right,
where strong national seat. But once MMP came in, I was able to vote for other people, and I was very happy.
Sure.
Hello, there's a question from, or rather a comment, I think, from Deborah about you mentioned quite a bit about the diversity, but perhaps Deborah would like to say something.
Good evening, Professor Geddis.
Hello.
Thank you for giving us your time today. It was a very long speech that you made, and it came in various different chunks, and I was really mentally caught up with the first part of your speech, which was the processes the elements that came together to actually get the need for electoral reform onto the public's agenda. And thinking in the UK, we've got certain disparate elements. So we have Brexit as being the major problem, but it's very difficult to make a direct link to Brexit consequences in the public's mind when we have a right-wing controlled media, and sadly even the BBC, because of its license fee arrangement with the government, does not even dare neither to criticise the government really, and certainly not to make direct linkages. So I was wondering how do we break into this cycle? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I regret to say I don't know is the short answer, because I just don't know enough, not being on the ground in the UK, about those sorts of issues or how you'd make those sort of connects. I mean, all I can say is that, I think as you saw in the UK with your own sort of slightly abortive attempt to bring about some form of electoral reform with the coalition and the referendum on whether to move to alternative vote, trying to get people interested in what looks to be just a mechanical kind of process type issue can be very, very difficult unless you can really pin it closely to things that feel much more current and much more immediate to them. Now, what those issues are and how you do that, I don't really feel able to speak to from, you know, coming from the other side of the world, except to say that in the New Zealand context, I don't think we'd have had electoral reform, certainly not in the big bang sense that we did, if we hadn't gone through all the other stuff in terms of policy change and people's unhappiness with that. I'll just leave it at that.
How key was having a royal commission or an independent, reliable body presenting an alternative to first past the post? How important was that a key element in getting people to accept the change from first past the post to something which ended up being MMP?
Yeah, so I think it was important on two vectors or two levels, if you like. The first was the unifying effect it had on the people who were out there campaigning for change, right? So it kind of, you know, because otherwise, you know, you can say, let's have electoral reform, and it's like saying, let's have sports, right? And everyone starts going, yeah, we'll play football, yeah, we'll play swimming, yeah, we'll do, and you start arguing about what kind of sport you're going to have, and you never get anywhere. Whereas with the Royal Commission having come out and said MMP is what we should be going to, you know, even people who might have thought, well, actually I prefer STV, came on board. So it settled the what will the alternative model be question. And then secondly, it gave a quite a strong point in the public debate, right? So it wasn't just a bunch of cranky weirdos, you know, wanting to change to a different voting system. It was, well, you know, we've had these pretty smart people looking at this for 2 years, and they've produced a report that's, you know, you can read it and it makes sense, and we can see why they're saying this and so on, and you can debate whether they're right or wrong, and it gives that credibility to the argument that otherwise it may not have had.
Thank you.
Sandra, I think you have a question.
Yes, hi, thank you, Professor. That was fantastic. A quick one. How do you persuade political parties to accept proportional representation when first past the post is working really well for them and it would mean they lose seats? And in the UK, there doesn't seem to be such a tradition of cross-party working as in other countries. So what would be the first step to introduce that idea of better cross-party consultation? It just doesn't feel the tradition is here in the UK for that.
Well, we didn't have it either. I mean, you know, Labour and National hated each other, and they never had to cooperate with anyone because, you know, one of them would always be majority governor. They didn't have to talk to anyone else. It's really important to realise that there was no politician in Labour or National who supported MMP. All the politicians hated it as a proposal. They were all against it. But of course, in the early 90s, if they came out and said, don't vote for this, it's terrible, because people hated politicians, it would have just caused, you know, it would have sold it better. So the politicians themselves actually took themselves out of the debate over MMP. They used sort of surrogates to front it, but they themselves were not active in the debate. They just said, we'll set up the referendum. You guys decide what you want to do. We recognize we can't really influence you, because if we try to tell you not to do it, it will be counterproductive. And they ended up with MMP. Then once MMP's on the table, you have to cooperate, right? If you don't cooperate, you can't govern. And you want to govern because, you know, you want the power, you want to be able to do it. Now, it took us a long time. It took us a couple of governmental cycles to work out how to do it properly. The first government, 96 to 99, was a bit of a disaster. It didn't fall apart completely, but it didn't work. And it was only when the second government came in 1999 that they started to get things working. And then it was only once they came out with the system of saying there'll be the major party will govern, it'll be seen as being the government, the support parties will come in around the edges to give it the majority, but the main party will recognize it has to give those smaller parties stuff in order to keep their support. The smaller parties recognize that if they try to do too much, the whole thing will fall apart and they will die. And once people learn that lesson, hey, what do you know? It works.
Brilliant. So there's hope for us. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really important thing to recognize is, you know, the politicians at the time said this can't work, we can't negotiate, we don't have those traditions, all the right things you said. We said the politicians were saying in the early 90s. You change their incentives, you change their structures, and all of a sudden they find they have to do things differently.
Juliet, I believe you have a question.
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much, Andrew. I was very interested in what you were saying about the early, in a way, cohesion building around the idea of transitioning to PR. And I wonder to what extent the unions fell in line very quickly, or whether they opposed this because of their internal politics, and whether or not the fear among the parties of the whole system perhaps being delegitimized because people were so disillusioned with it was the real driving force behind the PR.
Yeah, look, to be honest, I just can't remember what the unions approach, or whether they were supportive or oppositional to. I just can't remember. I don't know whether there was a common view of that, or whether it was split between different unions, some supporting. I just don't know, to be honest. Yeah. So I'm just going to have it's 28 years ago. I'm sorry, and I just
no, sorry, I fully appreciate that. It's just that it's one of the issues in Britain which has really stymied Labour getting a bit further more recently, right, because of the CLPs being in favour, 80% in favour of PR at the last party conference, but the big unions blocking it for internal reasons. And right, I think the homogeneous nature of New Zealand society perhaps helped in getting the public debate off the ground and considered in ways that it's very difficult to do here. So thank you very much for your insights.
Sure.
John, you have a question about the financing of politics. John?
Hi, sorry, I was just wondering, is the financing, would we see it as being equal to, or would it cost a lot more to have a proportional representation system in place, right, instead of the Firstpastthepost and continuation of that? In Ireland, we have an awful lot of referendi, and is that the case in New Zealand?
On the finance, I mean, if you're asking whether MMP costs more as a system than Firstpastthepost, we did increase the number of MPs. So we have when they set the system up, it was, if we stick with Firstpastthepost, you'll only have 99 MPs. But if you go to MMP, you'll have 120 MPs. And it was considered at the time that was an attempt to try to, basically stymie change, because who wants to vote for more MPs? So yeah, I guess having proportional representation maybe costs a little bit more if you're going to have more MPs. Whether that's necessary or not in the UK, I just don't know. The second part of your question, do we have a lot of referendums? Not as many as Ireland, because of course we've got no constitution, so we don't need to have referendums to make changes in the same way as you guys did around, say, gay marriage and so on. So we don't need referendums for things like that. We do have more than the United Kingdom, because governments have got into the habit of, on occasion, trying to kick difficult issues over to the public to decide for them. Nothing quite as disastrous as Brexit, but there's been other certain issues that have been put to the voters. For instance, the last government decided they wanted to change the New Zealand flag. And so they asked voters, do we want to do that or not? And we said no. But so things like that sometimes get put to referendum for questionable reasons. But certainly in New Zealand, we don't have to have referendums on anything. They get used by governments on occasion where the government feels it either needs political cover, or in the case of electoral reform, for genuine principled reasons, which are, this is actually something that it belongs to the people, and it just wouldn't be right, in quotation marks, for the government to make these sort of decisions for them.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer.
I wonder if it's about, perhaps I can try and summarize a little bit of what we've said. Personally, I see New Zealand as offering a very interesting model and very positive model of democratic fairness. The first country to give women the vote, about the first perhaps with Sweden to introduce social security in the 1930s. The introduction of land tribunals to settle long-standing complaints about the failure of the British government at the time to ratify the Waitangi Treaty. So New Zealand has a long tradition of very fair government. There's also what I feel is an important question of procedure. By holding a referendum on the principle before and then on the actual proposal, they avoided any crazy Brexit style vote where people voted for something that was only consultative, and then it was applied. So basically, what I get from this is a feeling of hope that it can happen, although the conditions within the UK may not be the same as in New Zealand. The current situation with Brexit seems to be even more dramatic than what is happening in New Zealand. And perhaps I can ask you to just comment briefly on that, as how you see that situation before we close.
Yeah. Well, once again, pointing out, it's difficult to know anything about a country when you're so far away and only engaging with it through the occasion sort of reading the media and so on. But it does seem to me that the real challenge will be making the public see, or giving the public good reasons to believe that things that they are unhappy about or concerned about with politics and with the sorts of decisions that are being made and how those decisions are being made ties back beyond the personalities of those involved to systemic problems with how they are chosen and the sorts of incentives they have once they're in power. And it's trying to get people to see beyond the immediate unhappiness with what's going on and the people who are involved in what's going on, to say, well, you're getting this because of the way in which you're choosing these people and the kind of incentives you're creating for them to behave. And once you can make those sort of connections in people's minds, you can then start talking to them about, well, if you do that slightly differently, you're going to get slightly different you will get different outcomes that will be better. And if you want to see how they can be better, well, other places do this differently. There are models out there. And if you can get that sort of discussion happening at a big enough level and a sort of, build up enough of a snowball effect, well, then you can start to put the pressure on those who are actually ultimately going to have to make the call to allow the people to decide, because one of the problems we have under our Westminster system with parliamentary supremacy is ultimately we depend on the politicians to let us make the changes that we want to. You can start to put the pressure on them to do so, and then you can get change. Now, is that easy? No, of course it's not. It requires a lot of work over a lot of time, but if you don't do the work, then the change doesn't happen.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Perhaps I can once again thank you for taking your time, particularly this late hour for you, and giving us a view of how it happened in New Zealand, and perhaps the path to the UK can in some way follow that. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm easily findable on the internet. So take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Really
Thank you. It was great.
Inspirational.
Thank you very much.
We have a lot to do in the UK.
Well, best of luck.
And you have some grassroots leaders in this call, and I think that we'll take it up and think about how we can achieve something here.
Professor Geddis, you haven't heard the Last of Us. Thank you very, very much.
I look forward to hearing more. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. And I'm off to bed. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.